In the spring of 1941, the Atlantic Ocean was not a battlefield but a vast, cold theatre of systemic desperation. For the British Empire, the sea lanes were the carotid artery of survival, a fragile thread of merchant ships carrying the lifeblood of a nation under siege. For the Third Reich, the ocean was a space to be haunted, a dark forest where their heavy surface units could emerge from the mist to shatter the British illusion of naval supremacy. At the center of this geopolitical tension sat a single vessel, a Leviathan of Krupp steel and predatory intent known as the Bismarck. She was the most feared instrument of war on the planet, yet her story is not one of triumph, but a case study in the catastrophic collision between technological hubris and the shifting tides of naval doctrine. The Bismarck was never intended to be a lone wolf, but by the time she was ready to strike, the strategic landscape of the Kriegsmarine had already begun to fracture. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder envisioned a balanced fleet, but Hitler's impatience and the overwhelming industrial might of the Royal Navy forced the Germans into a corner. Operation Rheinübung was the result of this compressed logic, a plan to send the Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen into the North Atlantic to decapitate the British convoy system. It was a mission born of necessity but executed with a profound lack of air cover and an even more profound misunderstanding of British resolve. Admiral Günther Lütjens, a man of cold calculation and traditional naval honor, led the expedition knowing that the odds were stacked against him from the moment they weighed anchor. The first systemic failure occurred long before a single shot was fired, rooted in the very geography of the German position. To reach the open Atlantic, the Bismarck had to navigate the narrow choke points of the North Sea, corridors that were watched by an invisible web of British intelligence and reconnaissance. On May 20th, the Swedish cruiser Gotland spotted the German flotilla, a chance encounter that immediately leaked into the British Admiralty's ears. The myth of German secrecy was punctured by the mundane reality of a neutral ship's observation, and from that moment, the Bismarck was no longer a ghost, she was a target. The British Home Fleet, commanded by Admiral John Tovey, began to tighten a noose that stretched from the fjords of Norway to the icy depths of the Denmark Strait. As the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen slipped into the Denmark Strait under the cover of a freezing fog, they were shadowed by the British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk, ships that utilized the primitive but effective eyes of early radar. The Germans were technologically superior in gunnery, but they were blind to the persistence of British tracking. On the morning of May 24th, the pride of the Royal Navy, the HMS Hood, and the brand-new battleship HMS Prince of Wales intercepted the German force. The Hood was an icon of British imperial power, a battlecruiser of immense grace and speed, but she carried a fatal architectural flaw. Her deck armor was thin, a relic of an era before long-range plunging fire became the standard of naval combat. The engagement lasted only minutes, but it would resonate for decades as one of the most shocking tactical disasters in history. The Bismarck's fifth salvo found the Hood's Achilles and Apo's heel, a shell plunging through the deck and detonating the aft magazines. In a terrifying pillar of flame that rose hundreds of feet into the air, the Hood was torn in two, vanishing beneath the waves in less than 3 minutes and taking all but 3 of her 1,418 crew members with her. It was a moment of pure, concentrated horror that silenced the Admiralty and sent a shockwave through the British public. The invincible symbol of the British Empire had been erased by a single, calculated strike from a ship that seemed to embody the unstoppable rise of the new order. However, the Bismarck did not emerge from the Denmark Strait unscathed. A single shell from the Prince of Wales had struck the German battleship's bow, severing fuel lines and contaminating her oil reserves. This was the turning point where tactical victory met strategic reality. Lütjens was now forced to abandon the raid and limp toward the coast of occupied France, trailing a massive oil slick that acted as a literal breadcrumb trail for the vengeful British fleet. The hunt was no longer about protecting convoys, it was a matter of national survival and primal retribution. Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued the simplest and most famous order of the naval war: sink the Bismarck. The pursuit that followed was an agonizing display of endurance and systemic friction. For days, the British fleet struggled against mountainous seas and dwindling fuel supplies to keep pace with the wounded giant. The Bismarck seemed to have slipped the net, disappearing into the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic as she headed toward the safety of the Luftwaffe's air umbrella near Brest. It was here that the British turned to their most desperate and unlikely weapon, the Fairey Swordfish biplanes of the HMS Ark Royal. These aircraft were technological anachronisms, open cockpit and string bags and made of wire and canvas that looked like they belonged in the skies of 1918 rather than 1941. The irony of the Swordfish was that their very obsolescence became their greatest strength. The Bismarck's sophisticated anti-aircraft fire control systems were calibrated for modern, high-speed monoplanes. The Swordfish flew so slowly that the German gunners consistently overcompensated, their shells bursting harmlessly in front of the sluggish biplanes. In the fading light of May 26, a flight of these relics descended through the clouds into a wall of flak. A single torpedo, dropped by a pilot who refused to blink in the face of certain death, struck the Bismarck's stern. It was a golden hit a freak occurrence that jammed the ship's twin rudders at a 15-degree turn. The Leviathan was not sunk, but she was crippled, forced to steam in a wide, helpless circle toward her pursuers. As night fell over the turbulent Atlantic, the crew of the Bismarck realized they were trapped in a steel coffin of their own making. Admiral Lütjens sent a final, somber radio message to Berlin, ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. The psychological atmosphere on board shifted from the euphoria of the Hood's destruction to a grim, fatalistic acceptance of the end. The German sailors, many of them barely out of their teens, spent their final hours waiting for the dawn, listening to the relentless pounding of the sea against a hull that could no longer steer its own destiny. The final execution began on the morning of May 27. The British battleships King George V and Rodney closed in, their heavy guns barking with a ferocity born of days of frustration and the memory of the Hood. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic demolition. The Bismarck superstructure was shredded, her gun turrets were silenced one by one, and her bridge was turned into a charnel house of twisted metal. Yet, despite the thousands of shells poured into her, the Bismarck refused to sink immediately, her heavy armor belt holding firm even as her upper decks became a burning inferno. The British cruisers eventually moved in to deliver the final torpedoes, while the German crew, according to survivors, began scuttling the ship to prevent her capture. The Bismarck rolled over and vanished into the abyss at 10:39 a.m., leaving behind a sea choked with oil and struggling men. Out of a crew of over 2,200, only 114 were rescued before a U-boat scare forced the British ships to depart, leaving hundreds more to drown in the freezing water. The destruction of the Bismarck was a definitive end to the era of the surface raider and a brutal confirmation that the age of the battleship was being eclipsed by the carrier-borne aircraft. It was a victory of persistence over perfection, of a crumbling empire's collective will over a single, magnificent machine that possessed everything but a soul and a viable strategy. The philosophical takeaway of the Bismarck saga is found in the tragic irony of its existence. It was a masterpiece of engineering designed for a type of warfare that had already ceased to exist. In the end, the most powerful battleship in the world was brought down not by an equal, but by a handful of canvas biplanes and a series of minor, cumulative failures in judgment and luck. It serves as a haunting reminder that in the machinery of total war, no amount of steel can compensate for a lack of vision, and even the most formidable giants are vulnerable to the smallest, most archaic stings of fate. The Bismarck now rests nearly 3 miles down, an iron tomb in the eternal darkness of the Atlantic floor. Her guns are silent, her hull is scarred, and the fires that once raged her decks have been extinguished by the crushing pressure of the deep. She remains a monument to the futility of hubris and the terrible cost of a war that demanded everything from the men who sailed her. The sea has reclaimed the steel, but the story of her rise and fall remains etched in the memory of the waves, a dark fable of a titan that was born to rule the oceans and died as a victim of the very progress it sought to defy. The echoes of the Bismarck's final salvos have long since faded into the salt and the wind. The world moved on, the empires fell, and the technology of destruction evolved into realms the sailors of 1941 could scarcely imagine. Yet, when the fog rolls across the Denmark Strait and the Atlantic turns a cold, unforgiving grey, the ghost of the Leviathan still lingers. It is a story of iron and blood, of a ship that was too big for the world that built it, and a reminder that even the strongest armor eventually yields to the relentless, crushing weight of history. The hunt is over, the sea is still, and the Bismarck belongs to the silence of the deep forever.